Hello and welcome. Once again, you are joining us live, the epicenter, passionate people seeking a life of freedom, choice, and abundance. And we got a rip snorter today, and by a rip snorter, I mean we are going to. If the things that you like are things that like money, history, kind of stuff like that, then this is going to be awesome. You're gonna love it. Yeah, you're gonna freaking love this one. Or at least I hope you do. I hope you will, because I spent a lot of time this week going like full beaker mode on the history of a whole bunch of stuff. I'm very excited for today. Gabby, how are you? Great fade out there, by the way.
Thank you. I decided to remain mute and see if that would help. I think it did.
I think it did. You did well.
I think it
You
did.
did well.
I'm well. How are you, Goose?
We played to both of our strengths. I just got to waffle on, and you got to.
You just talked.
So last week so firstly, to everyone who's here live, and there's more and more people every week, we love seeing you here. So thank you for joining us.
Hey guys,
it makes this so much more enjoyable for
welcome.
us to know that you're here and to share this with you and to do it live. So hello to everyone that's here in the chat. Brett, Rich, Let's Rock, Matthew, Gavin, Neutral Rockets, Lisa, Heartbeat, and everyone else who hasn't yet said g'day in the chat. We're excited that you're here as well. It makes it super worthwhile for us. Now, last week, we unpacked the illusion of prosperity. We talked about how GDP and wages and housing give the appearance of growth, but once you adjust for money creation, real prosperity has been hollowed out. Now, there's a lot of controversial stuff last week, and it kind of rubbed a few people I wouldn't say the wrong way. I think it rubbed a few people against the grain a little bit, and caused people to sort of go, okay, this might be the situation where it might be different to what we think it is, which is the point. I want to talk, and we'll do it at the end. I actually want to go back and talk about one of the charts that we covered in last week's episode, because there was a little bit of contention around it, and I want to kind of clarify a few things, but I don't want that to get in the way of the start of this one. So we'll do it towards the end. Because this week we're going to be digging into, so last week was kind of like why it feels like it's getting harder to get ahead, kind of broken that down on an individual level. Yep. Now we're going to zoom out a little bit and go through history, hyperinflation, and we're going to talk about what happens when trust in money dies. So it's a big one today. And Gabby, let's just jump straight into it. I know that you've got a bunch of questions to ask, because I went full mode and have built a 40-odd page report, which we'll get into the community in the next few days. We've both been very busy over the last little bit. We'll get into the community in the next few days. So this is all going to be broken down in detail in a big report. But do you want to just go to the first slide? I want to just open up with the Von Mises.
For sure. Let's do that. Woof.
We've got a new slide sharing method we're testing today.
Oh, no, apparently it's not working. Good. Okay. This one. There we go.
Woof. So I want to start here. I want to start with this, because this is such a powerful passage, and this is from Ludwig von Mises, who is a major figure in the Austrian School of Economics, and this is from his book Human Action in 1949. This is verbatim from the book. But then, finally, the masses wake up. They become suddenly aware of the fact that inflation is a deliberate policy. But then finally the masses wake up. They become suddenly aware of the fact that inflation is a deliberate policy and will go on endlessly. A breakdown occurs. The crack-up boom appears. Everybody is anxious to swap his money against real goods, no matter whether he needs them or not, no matter how much money he has to pay for them. And within a very short time, within a few weeks or even days, the things which were used as money are no longer used as a medium of exchange. They become scrap paper. Nobody wants to give away anything against them. It was this that happened with the continental currency in America in 1781, and with the French mandats territoriaux in 1796, and with the German mark in 1923. And it will happen again whenever the same conditions appear. If a thing has to be used as a medium of exchange, public opinion must not believe that the quantity of this thing will increase beyond all bounds. Inflation is a policy that cannot last. And I think that that is such a powerful frame up, because that kind of tells us a couple of things. particularly as it relates to fiat currencies. We could probably stop showing that slide now. What this actually tells me, and we're obviously going to dig into quite a lot of stuff today, but one of the most interesting things that I took away from that, and I spent a bit of time thinking about over the last week, there's a lot of conversation around like debt to GDP ratios and stuff like that. Is it like the story around the US debt to GDP ratio is a fairly common thing. A lot of people kind of know that story at the moment. It's around about nearly 130% debt to GDP ratio. And everyone thinks that, not everyone, there's an increasing awareness that a situation like a high debt to GDP ratio could lead to some sort of currency issue. People don't typically understand what that means, but they recognize that it's bad. Are they going to default on their debts or whatever? But actually, what is most interesting is that debt to GDP doesn't actually matter as much as confidence in a currency does. Because if you look at the Australian debt to GDP ratio, it's like 45, 50%, something like that, right? It's not very high. It's pretty low. But if the people lose faith or lose confidence in the currency, then the currency can collapse if it's a fiat currency. And for those of you listening at home, fiat is a derivative of a Latin term, which means by decree. It basically just means that this money is worth this much because I said so, because someone said it's worth this much money. And so whilst there's a direct relationship between sovereign debt and money printing, it is not absolutely true that those two things must exist. Because if you look at Japan, it's got a debt to GDP ratio of 250%. And there's countries that have had less than 100% debt to GDP ratios and have had their currencies collapse. So actually, what matters most is the perception of the currency. Public opinion must not believe that the quantity of this thing will increase beyond all bounds.
Mm.
So that's a good starting point. So where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, it's interesting because as someone who myself, I have never, up until maybe the last few years, I've never been a big history person, transparently. It's just not something I think certain families, like I will go to your family groups and I'll hear lots of conversations around history and historical figures. That's not the environment that I grew up in. I wasn't really drawn to it at school. And so what's really interesting to me about all this stuff is actually kind of expanding your awareness to these historical environments to see the patterns.
Yeah.
And realizing that it's not that difficult to see what is coming in the future if you just look back over history and you just, the cookie cutter there seems to be about the same shape as what's happening now. So it's not that unreasonable to expect what's going to happen next, which I think is really it's been an interesting, in some ways it's calming, I think, as well, because if you don't understand history, a lot of the change that happens, it's hard to predict, and you feel like you're like, how the hell are we meant to know what's happening? But if you look back and again find those patterns, as we'll kind of cover when we talk through the other fiat currencies and the history there, it's really, I think, in some ways calming. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, but at least there's some answers there.
Yeah, 100%. So we're obviously going to be talking a lot about currency collapse in this episode, and I think one of the most interesting things is, and we'll definitely, let's prepare to kind of try and get through all of the stuff that we cover in the report. But people think about currency collapse and they think about the most extreme cases. Some people may be familiar with the story of Weimar Germany, maybe Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Venezuela, Argentina. These extreme cases where currencies collapsed really quickly, right? But most people don't realize that currencies collapse all the time. They've been collapsing and changing, ad infinitum. And we're going to go through it in a moment. But the average lifespan of a fiat currency is 27 years, just 27 years. That's the average lifespan of a fiat currency. And even in Australia, which is super interesting. So Australia currently has the Australian dollar. Now we get born into these systems, these constructs. So most people, maybe all, but I don't know the age of everyone on here. Most people on this live stream or listening to this episode will only be familiar with living in an Australian dollar society in Australia.
Yep.
But that only existed since 1966. Before that, it was the Australian pound.
Mhm.
And so the Australian dollar has been, so the US went off the gold standard in 1971, and that's when the US dollar became pure fiat, which just means purely by decree. So because I said so, we're going to dig into all that a little later. Australia changed from the Australian pound to the Australian dollar in 1966, and it was fiat from day one. The Australian pound was fiat from 1932. 31, 32. We'd have to double check that, but from 1932, when the Australian pound went off the gold standard. Before before Australia was on the Australian pound, it was on the British pound, and before it was on the British pound, they used some hodgepodge, cacophony of different currencies, everything from Dutch guilders to Spanish, Spanish silver coins and Indian murgas and all kinds of different stuff used at barter systems or whatever. And just to pick up on that really interesting fact that I was sharing with you before the British shipped over the British had to ship over enough currency for the Australians to use the British currency system. They actually had to ship the currency over, but before that, there wasn't enough British pounds in circulation in Australia to use the British pound as a consistent currency. So it was a mixed bag of whatever was floating around. But one of the things they did, and one of the things that existed as a primary form of currency for a while, was what they called the holy dollar. The Australians took the Spanish silver dollar, then they punched a hole in the middle of it, and they called it the holy dollar, HOLEY, which is hilarious,
Beautiful.
right? That's classic Australianism. They created the holy dollar. So the holy dollar was worth 5 shillings, and the holy dollar was worth 5 shillings, and then the piece that was cut out of the middle, the dump, was worth 1 shilling threepence, 3 pence. And that was what was, and so the history even of money in Australia is really interesting. And most people, like, we're born into these systems, right? And just using that as one example, we're born into these systems and these ideas, and because it's kind of like the whole the analogy of boiling a frog in a pot, right? So if you, as the analogy goes, if you were to take a frog and put it in a pot of water and then slowly heat it up, it wouldn't recognize that the water is getting warmer until it cooks itself to death, right? Basically. Now, the thing is, we're born inside the pot. And rather than the heat going up quickly, the heat's going up fairly slowly. So we're just used to it. We're just like, yeah, the heat, it gets warmer. That's what happens. It gets warmer every year. Yes, inflation's normal. Yes, this is normal. And actually, it's not. It's completely artificial. And so we don't have the perspective. If all we do is use our lived experience as our frame of reference, we don't have the perspective to understand what is really going on. And so by looking at other examples, historical examples, we can then gain the perspective of where we actually are. So I think with that frame, let's get stuck into it.
Yeah. So what are some other examples of currencies that have gone through these kind of do we say collapse? Currency collapse?
Well, currency death. What do you want to call it? They've died. So
They've died.
Look. It's a really good distinction, right? Because I would say currency collapse is probably when we're going to be talking about things like inflation and hyperinflation, but actually pretty much all of them have died from hyperinflation. So maybe it's the same thing. But there's probably examples of currencies being changed because of regime change or whatever. But there's a phraseology which some people may know. It's a little bit old school, but I remember hearing it when I was younger. Not worth a continental is a phrase that some people know. So that's actually, the continental dollar was created in 1775 and lasted 6 years during the Revolutionary War, and then it was abandoned. And that's where the phrase "not worth a continental" came from. And then I'm not sure. I remember as a kid watching the news when on the news they would talk about they would refer to the US dollar when they're talking about like currencies and stuff. When they're doing the financial part of the news section, they would talk about things. They would refer to the US dollar as greenbacks. Has anyone ever heard the US dollar referred to as a greenback? Well, the greenback was actually a currency in the US, which existed from 1862 to 1879. So it only lasted 17 years. It was issued during the Civil War, and then it was replaced when the US returned to a gold standard. So it was replaced by the US dollar. But you also have got the French assignats, the French territorial mandats. You've got the Dutch, the German paper mark, the Zimbabwe dollar, which we'll talk about inflation in a moment. But we'll talk about inflation values in a moment. But the Zimbabwe dollar lasted 29 years in its fiat form. In fact, do you want to we actually have a chart. Do you want to find that
Yeah, I was
chart of
just
some of
thinking that.
those?
Yep.
So the Zimbabwe dollar actually lasted quite a long time in the grand scheme of things, but in its fiat form, when it depegged from any kind of underlying base metal or base commodity, it only lasted 29 years. It reached an inflation rate of 79.6 billion%. Sorry, Dr. Chen C has entered the room. Hello, Dr. Chen C, the esteemed Dr. Chen C. And his comment, which is not controversial at all, has been held for review. So I'm just going to let that get through. So the Zimbabwe dollar reached an inflation rate of 79.6 billion% month over month in 2008. 79.6 billion%. Yeah, that was the monthly inflation rate. Now, by the way, just to not to put the cart before the horse, because we've got a long way to go before we start talking about this kind of stuff. But Hungary had the worst inflation rate in history in 1946. It inflated at a rate of 41.9 quadrillion% in a single month. Prices were doubling every 15 hours. But to go back to some of these kind of currencies, as you're talking about, some of these currencies that have failed, you've got the Venezuelan bolivar has had several incarnations. The US dollar is currently in its fiat era, so 1971. So we're just talking about fiat era, is 54 years so far. Now, what I would point out about that is 54 years is roughly double the average lifespan of fiat currencies.
Well, it is double, yeah.
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 It is double. Yeah. So now that doesn't mean anything necessarily, but it's interesting to say the least. So there have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. The Yugoslav dollar, the Hungarian pengo, the German paper mark, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of currencies which have failed over time. And what's interesting is Ray Dalio did a big deep dive study on this in his book Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises. And there was a whole bunch of research done by the Cato Institute. That's where where the 27-year averages come from. So if you look at this chart, by the way, the 27-year average is not the average of just the currencies on that chart. The 27-year average is based on the research done by Ray Dalio and the Cato Institute. And they looked at currencies over the last few centuries that have failed, and the average lifespan of a fiat currency is 27 years. Now, let me clarify that a little bit, because what we're specifically talking about is the lifespan of currencies when they move to fiat. So when they stop being backed by a commodity. Now, typically a commodity is going to be a hard metal, but it could be other things as well. So I'm going to be careful here that I say something accurate, but
yes, please.
The Rentenmark, which is the Rentenmark was which was a currency that the Germans moved to after one of their currency collapses, was backed by a mortgage on the entire industrial and agricultural resource of the country. So it's basically like the industry of the country. So it's backed, but it was still backed by something, right? You get the idea. So fiat currencies are backed by nothing. And so what we're looking at here is the lifespan of fiat currencies. And if you look at the British pound's often recognized as being like the longest continuous currency that still survives. So it's the current oldest surviving currency, because it's been around for 330 years, but it's gone through several incarnations. So it's gone from being backed by a silver standard. So if anyone's heard the term pound sterling, British pound sterling, GBP, or pound sterling, that's because it was backed by sterling silver back in the day. Then in the mid 1800s, it moved to the gold standard. That's when it became gold backed. But that's also when it broke away, and that's when China and India, which were on silver standards, and the stock to flow ratio of silver was lower, so there was more silver supply, so it devalued faster, all of that kind of stuff. The point here is the British pound has gone through several incarnations to stay alive. It hasn't been the same currency, and it did actually last. It's been around for 330 years, but in the last 94 years, since 1931, it became a fiat currency, pure fiat, completely not backed by anything. And in the last 94 years, it's lost more than 99% of its purchasing power. So 330-year lifespan, and then a third of just under a third of that. It's lost 99% of its purchasing power because it moved off moved off any kind of backing standard. So
So,
you go on.
so something similar happened to the US dollar. I'm just thinking because again, looking at the chart, if the average lifespan for a currency, a fiat currency, is 27 years,
Yeah.
and the US dollar is currently 54 years old.
Yes.
Why is the US dollar still alive?
That is a really it's a really good question, and we're going to actually it's a good question, and we're going to dig more into this a little later when we look at currency comparisons, but I'll talk about it now because it's very relevant.
Yep.
So something very interesting happened in 1944, and that was Bretton Woods. And I'm just going to get up some data on this that I was just pulling together earlier. So what's super interesting is basically the entire world is on a fiat standard now because of the US dollar. So after World War II, so the US stepped in World War II. They came in late. They brought in a lot of funding to the war. They funded a lot of the sides of the war. A lot of the other countries owed them a lot of favors. At the end of the war, they said, right, here's the deal. Because we came in and funded everything and saved all you guys and, you know, dropped the nuke on Japan and ended the war and did all that kind of stuff. Here's what we want. We want the US dollar to become the global reserve currency. And that was effectively the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. And so everyone said, yep, okay, we're all going to use the global reserve currency, the currency that's going to be used for trade and, you know, the referential currency for everyone is going to be the US dollar, which at the time was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, 35 US dollars per ounce of gold. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, basically said that any country that wanted to participate in post-war world trade, so if you wanted to be able to participate in global economic trade, you had to align with the dollar gold system, which basically meant you had to use dollars for trade settlements and all that kind of stuff. So that moved the entire world onto a US dollar standard back in 1944. So that's obviously before they went off the gold standard. So basically every country piggybacked onto the US dollar. They basically pegged themselves either directly or indirectly. They pegged themselves by relationship to the US dollar. Now, the reason I say by relationship is because some countries pegged. They said, okay, our currency is worth 25 units of our currency for $1 US, and they've just stayed pegged. So whatever happens with the US dollar, then their currency is 25 units to the 25 to 1. There's others that have had a floating peg. Like I think Singapore has a floating peg where they say, look, we're going to peg the value of the Singapore dollar to the US dollar within a range, right? And as long as it sits within this range, it's all good. It's about the same. So it's floated in a range. There are other currencies which have stayed referential to the US dollar, but have specifically and deliberately devalued their currency versus the US dollar. So they've stayed referential to the US dollar whilst specifically devaluing their currency. And the best example of this is China. And again, we'll cover off this a little bit later because I want to talk about Rome in a moment. But so China deliberately and specifically devalued its currency so that it could stay, so the cost of labor and the cost of goods in China were cheap in comparison to the US dollar, which allowed for China to dominate exports and to become the supplier of the world. So it deliberately devalued itself referentially, right? So now the problem with all of this is because everyone became either pegged to or referentially associated with the US dollar. When the US dollar moved off the gold standard, when it stopped gold convertibility in August 1971, every other currency that was participating in world trade effectively had the same thing happen, right? And so every currency started to float. Like it became basically global fiat. Now, many countries already had come off gold-backed or silver-backed or commodity-backed currencies anyway, but it effectively moved to like, we'll call it like a US-pegged versus gold-backed currency kind of system. But then when the global reserve currency went fully fiat, it went full float, then that basically meant that everyone went full float, right? Because nothing affects anything, right? So it's kind of like, imagine that, there's a massive cruise ship and there's a lifeboat hanging out the back and it's tied to the cruise ship. by a big rope, and that lifeboat is the US. And then everyone else, every other country, tied their lifeboat to the US's lifeboat, and then the US cut the cord to the ship. So now the US is just floating around the ocean randomly, and every other country's floating around as well, and nobody knows what's going on, right? So,
Mhm.
so that sort of happened there. Now we will talk a little bit more about because we've got some really good examples to kind of show what's been happening with the US dollar in a little bit. But I want to go back a little bit further first, because this isn't a modern problem. It's very easy to think, okay, this is a modern thing. So this all started in like the 1900s. No, that's not true at all. Currencies have been debasing for a very, very, very long time. So we're going to go all the way back to ancient Rome. So what's super interesting is one of the most interesting examples of this. And by the way, when people think about things like currency collapse and hyperinflation, they think about things happening really fast. I may have already mentioned that. They think about these like sudden, 79 billion% inflation in a month. These are extreme cases, right? And even if you look at Weimar, Germany, it happened over the course of like 5 years, was basically a currency collapse. It doesn't always happen quickly. It can happen quite slowly as well. And this is exactly what happened in the Roman Empire. Now, there's obviously many reasons for any major thing to happen in history, but one of the primary drivers of the collapse of the Roman Empire was the collapse of their currency. And so the silver denarius was first minted in 211 BC, and it was nearly pure silver. Now, by the time Emperor, do you want to bring up do you want to bring up that chart, the silver content of the Roman denarius over time?
Sure.
So when the denarius was minted in 211 BC, it was pure silver. It was a silver coin, and it was trusted. Everyone used it. The soldiers were paid in it. International trade flourished. Got to remember the Roman Empire was very big. You had the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. It expanded all the way through Europe and Persia and all of this kind of stuff. And the silver denarius, because of its purity and because of the trust in the system, everything flourished. Everyone trusted it, and trade was easy, savings was easy, all of that kind of stuff. It gave everyone confidence. Now, by the time that Augustus was the emperor, he was emperor from 27 BC to 14 AD, the denarius still contained 95% silver, but it had been diluted a little bit, but it wasn't too bad. It was a little bit of monetary inflation. Now, this is the same, right? Because it's losing its silver quantity. So what they're doing is they're expanding the amount of money supply using less silver. So it's devaluing the actual currency. By the time you get to Emperor Caracalla in 198 to 217 AD, the denarius was only 50% silver. And by the time you get to the reign of Gallienus in 253 to 268 AD, the silver content had fallen below 5%. Right, so the coin started as solid silver, and then by the end, it was a bronze disc with a thin wash of silver that was sitting over the top of it. Now, what happened? Okay, so what actually happened? Well, over that period of time, people started to realize that these coins weren't worth what they once were, and so over time, people started to lose faith in the currency. And this is the point of this whole episode. What happens when people lose when trust in currencies fail? Right. And so prices rose because people are like, well, that a denarius isn't worth that much anymore. So prices went up, price of bread went up, soldiers demanded more money for their pay. Merchants refused the coins, barter started to replace it. Now, one of the interesting things is this didn't happen all the way at the end, but it was only 5%. This actually started to happen earlier. The Roman soldiers started to say, hey, these coins aren't worth as much as they used to be worth. They're not fully silver. So we want more coins. If you want us to keep fighting your wars, if you want us to keep going to work, you're going to have to pay us more coins. Now, of course, what they did is they said, oh, okay, so we'll just print more coins with less silver quantity in them. And so that continued the debasement. So they inflated the money supply by having less silver per coin. And so devalued, and this started to escalate and accelerate. Now, this whole process took like 300 years, roughly. So these things can happen slowly, but they still happen. Now, then what happened with the Roman Empire, you had the crisis of the 3rd century. that was 235 to 284 AD. So right around when the currency was at its worst, when it was down about 5% silver in the coin. And the part of the reason is because soldiers didn't want to fight, trade was weakened, people didn't have confidence in the currency and the economy, people were disgruntled, everyday people couldn't save, yada yada yada. So it created a lot of discontent within the society at that time, and that allowed for things like invasions, civil wars, all of that kind of stuff, and these things that. So some of them are extraneous events, but they also collided with this kind of like a weakened economic situation. So that created a situation where there was a whole bunch of different emperors, like, there was an emperor every few months for a period of time there, right? Then in 301 AD, Diocletian tried to fix prices. So he delivered his edict on maximum prices. He said, I know how to fix this. Rather than fixing the money, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell everyone you're only allowed to charge this much for these different things. So this is government intervention in pricing models.
Mhm.
A loaf of bread
Always goes well.
So so his edict on maximum prices set fixed costs for more than 1,000 different goods, with death penalties for violators. So he said how much a loaf of bread should cost, how much a bushel of wheat should cost, how much a toga should cost, how much a liter of wine should cost, all of these different things. He said, no, I don't give a shit how much the money's worth. I'm going to tell you the maximum amount you can charge in these. And so basically people were like, well, that doesn't work for us. So the black market started to proliferate, trade collapsed, because nobody could trust the money. It's just like the money's worthless, and you're telling us that you're going to tell us how much we have to. It doesn't work, right? So that doesn't work. And it wasn't until 312 AD that Emperor Constantine, sometimes known as Constantine the Great, introduced the solidus, which was a gold coin of consistent purity. Now that stayed true for centuries, but the problem was 3 centuries of corrosion of trust in the currency weakened the entire empire, and that was one of the major reasons for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, was because they could never recover from the undermining of that fabric of their society through that. Now, here's a sort of a counterfactual to that, by the way. And I've talked about it a little bit before, but a counterfactual to that, and kind of supports the idea of the solidus, is the florin. Now, Florence in Italy in the Renaissance is famous for a couple of reasons. So that was the invention of the double entry bookkeeping, the ledger. So that actually allowed credit. So until the invention of the double entry bookkeeping accounting, there was no way to effectively manage credit. So they actually created credit markets. Very interesting. But also the florin in Florence had a what was it? I can't remember how much what the metal composition was exactly, but it stayed true. It didn't debase its value for 400 years. So it was first minted in 1252, and it maintained its weight and purity for almost 400 years. Now, because of that, it was possible for anyone, through the fruits of their labor, to save their way to wealth. Can you imagine that? Can you just imagine, right? Just if you're listening to this at home, I just want you to imagine a world where you could save 10% of your income every week, every month, every year. Let's say you did that from the age of 20. And you could save 10% of your income, and you knew that in 100 years and 200 years, it'd be worth the same amount. It'd have the same purchasing power. You could save, so for every, that's crazy. And that's how families developed generational wealth. So,
yeah,
as Charlie said, it would be slightly less fun, but go on.
Less fun. It's just like, I think about, you and I we happened to be in Florence about a year ago, actually. Yep. You imagine so much of the magnificence that came out of that period is because of the stable economy, right? And because people could put their money towards things that they valued rather than just having to spend just to keep ahead, right?
Yeah, 100%. And that's also why, and this is like I won't deviate too far, but it's also why if you go to Melbourne or even Sydney CBD, but Melbourne's a really good example actually, because I won't go into why, but it has a lot of very big old stone buildings, like these beautifully like
Yeah.
crazy big. What and why were they able to build buildings like that back then, but we can't build them now? Well, it's
Yeah.
because the currency actually was the money was actually worth more right, than it is now.
Yeah.
And so what you had in Florence is you had people that were able to save and build wealth and save money, and it didn't devalue, and so they were able to become patrons to be able to support people like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael and all of these other people. And that was in fact why Florence was the heartbeat of the entire Renaissance period, a period of absolute flourishing and breakthroughs in arts and science and mathematics and all of these kind of things, because the currency wasn't being debased, which meant that people could save their way to wealth. They could give money to other people to allow them space and time to think. And that's actually what was created, was a tremendously abundant society. Now, were there problems like disease and, so yes, of course, because we haven't developed technologies that solved for those yet. So you can't turn around and say, oh yeah, but, they, I don't know, they, like, in old England where they used to just tip their sewage into the streets. That's because they didn't have a better system, right? But that's not an exchange for, you got to be able to separate these ideas. So the sort of the point here is that when we talk about currency collapse, it doesn't always happen suddenly. It can happen slowly, but the mechanics are always the same. The mechanics are always the same. And so, do you want to just bring up the mechanics of the circle, the cycle? Because there's effectively a 5-stage cycle for all currencies. It's kind of made this up myself, so proprietary, yay. The 5-stage currency life cycle. Basically, a new currency is created. There always has to be a start. So there's always going to be a start. So a new currency is created, or a new currency is issued, and usually it's under the premise that this one's going to be better than the other one. So Rome introduced the solidus. So Weimar Germany, after the paper mark, they introduced the Rentenmark, which I mentioned earlier, which was backed by the industry and agriculture of the country. Zimbabwe went off the Zim dollar and started using US dollars. Venezuela rebranded the Bolivar 3 different times. All of this kind of stuff. But effectively, there's always a start. There's always like, no, we're going to start again. We're going to create a new currency, or a variation of the currency, or we're going to reissue the currency, or we're going to start again. We're going to do that. And then inevitably what happens over time is inflation becomes a policy. Now, let's pause there for a second. Why? Right? Because it doesn't have to. Let's just say you said, okay, I'm going to start this currency and it's going to be backed by gold. So we're going to have a gold-backed currency. Good. That's all well and good. Great. Perfect. Awesome. Nice. A sound money currency. Why is it that governments move to fiat? Why do they break the link? And why do they then turn around and say, actually, you know what we're going to do is we're just going to print more money? Well, the reason they do that is because popularity is expensive, right? So wars are expensive. Welfare states are expensive. So all of these things that people want and take for granted, free healthcare, free education, public infrastructure, blah, 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 they all cost money. Yep. And so what politicians do is, or wars. So a great one is and we've spoken about this before on the podcast as well, but the start of World War One, actually, no one turned around and said, you know what we're going to do? Let's go start a world war. It was actually the August Weekend War. It was supposed to be, it was a war between England and the Germany, but it wasn't called Germany at the time. I've got a mental blank, but it wasn't called Germany at the time, but effectively Germany. And the English thought it was all going to be over and done within a weekend. They're like, we'll just knock this over in a weekend. So it's called the August Weekend War. Except that didn't happen. So they got there, and then the fighting continued, and then they went, oh shit, this has taken a little bit longer than we thought. And then what they would normally do is they would normally sell war bonds, and they'd say, hey, people, we need to fund a war. Can you give us your money, and we'll pay you back later? So they'd sell war bonds. But nobody wanted to fund the war. And so they said, well, nobody wants to give us money. We got that printer over there. What happens if we just like hit the button and they printed a bit more money, and they started to print more money? And the The Germans did that too. And so they both ended up printing money and devaluing their currency. And that's actually why World War I lasted so long, because normally a war would only last as long as the countries could afford to fund the war. But if you've got a money printer, you can afford to fund the war for a pretty long time because you can just keep printing more money. That's why World War I lasted so long. Now, so wars are expensive. So same thing happened in the US with Vietnam. The US had funded Vietnam. That was in the 60s, just before they broke the gold peg in 1971. They'd blown up all of this stuff. Now, the reason they broke the gold peg in 1971 is because they'd already been money printing. They'd already been money printing. They just hadn't been explicit with it. And then the French turned around and said, we think you're like, we can see what's going on here. You're fighting these very expensive wars and you're doing all of this kind of stuff. We don't think you're actually making as much money as you're spending. You must be printing it. We actually think you've got more money in circulation than you've got gold. We don't think that link exists. So the French actually sent a warship over to, because the US held the French's gold in Fort Knox. The French sent over a warship to say, hey, give us our freaking gold back. And then the US went, oh, no, we don't do that anymore. So new rules. Dollars are not exchangeable for gold. Sorry, you can't convert them. So we don't do that anymore. Sorry, guys. No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to give you your gold back. And that's when that broke. And I know you want to say something, but just let me go on this for a second. So wars are expensive. And so governments print money to fund wars. Governments print money to fund welfare states for popularity. And also because, also because they're trying to care. They're trying to do the right thing. Like healthcare and stuff is good. Like they're not just, a lot of it is for votes, but also it's because they're trying to do the right thing. Maybe misguided approach. Subsidies, jobs, all of this kind of stuff. Larger government. Governments don't like to raise taxes. And so this is an easier way to tax people. So they need more money, but they can't raise taxes because taxes are incredibly unpopular. So it's easier to print more money, and that's a stealth tax. And it's easier to run a deficit than it is to run a surplus for a government. And it makes them look better because they can say, hey, look, we built more schools. You've got nicer roads. Stop complaining about the potholes. And so it's a political incentive that they then go and break the relationship between a hard money standard and turn it into fiat. That's why inflation becomes policy. Gabby, go.
Oh no, I was gonna just say that was a very French thing for the French to do, wasn't it? Very like justice, like this isn't fair. But no, I was just thinking through like with inflation, it's I feel like there's an element of like in this cycle, obviously a new currency is created. People feel a sense of optimism. Again, this all ties back to human behavior and trust. And so I think a lot of the time governments feel that they are allowed to print and create more of their currency because they're not in their term, whether literally now the literal term that they're in office, but they're not experiencing that pain yet, but they're gradually stacking it up. And so when they start to do it, there's still a very high trust from the people in the currency. So there's no backlash at that time. But then as we can see as it comes into the next stage, when people start to realize, and that's when it starts to become untenable, right?
Yeah, of course. So and it's a really good point, right? So trust is the thing that underpins all of this. Trust is the only reason that the Australian dollar has any value. It's purely mimetic value. That's all it is. 10 Australian dollars is not worth the plastic that it's printed on. The plastic that it's printed on is worth a fraction of a cent or something, right? So the only reason that $10 is worth $10 is because we believe it. We all, agree.
Yeah, we all choose to believe that the 1 and 0 written on this piece of paper means
because we trust it, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to spend too much time sort of sitting there and saying that like politicians are bad and they're all just, I think a lot of it's stupidity and ignorance, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure.
And when things happen slowly, it's a lot different than when things happen quickly. So imagine a politician got into power and then they inflated the currency by 1,000,000% in a year. That'd be really obvious and they'd very quickly be kicked out, right? That wouldn't last. But when it's slow and it's just a little bit, it's only a little bit. It's kind of like, if you have a little bit of dessert every single night, right?
Yep.
a little bit, just a little bit of dessert is okay. A little bit of dessert every night and after lunch every day is probably going to put on a few kilos, right? But it's going to happen slowly. You want to say something, Gabby?
No, I was thinking of the analogy as well. I was thinking it's like eating French fries after dinner every night or something for your whole life. It's like you may not immediately notice it, but then you might get to your 60s and come up with disease or something. And it's like it's the stacking of the unhealthy habits in whatever domain that create this diseased environment eventually.
Yeah, I think that's not to. I hope I don't offend anyone here, but I think it's called the Housewife's Curse or the Housewife's Bane, where through over the last whatever couple of decades, it's pretty typical for housewives and mothers and stuff. And I'm not making any sort of judgment claims here, to put on a little bit of extra weight, and it's really normal. It's really normal for that to be the case. But the reason for that, actually, there was a big study on this study. Yeah, I read this study on it when I was like in my 20s, because they eat the leftovers, they eat the little bit. So they'll be cooking dinner and they'll have a little taste, and then there'll be a little bit left over, and then they don't want to waste that. And all these little bits all add up. It's all these like tiny little bits, right? So that all add up. So anyway, so let's go back to the diagram. So firstly, a currency is issued. Then,
Yep.
because governments want to spend more money than they've got, they turn to inflation as a policy. Then, whether it happens quickly or slowly, people start to recognize that it's an issue. Then they start to move their money into real assets. Then the money fails. That becomes, we're going to go into the behavioral dynamics of that in a moment. But then the money fails, and then they need a new form of currency. And that's basically the life cycle of every single currency that's ever existed. So a currency is issued, then it becomes inflated, and you can trace that back to gold beads, wampum shells, cacao beans as well. Any currency, it starts because it's scarce. Then inflation happens. Then people recognize that inflation has happened, and then people say, "I don't want that crap anymore." And then when people don't want it anymore, then it fails. And then they have to come up with something new. So that's the 5 stage of the currency life cycle. Now, this is interesting because those mechanics explain the sequence, but the collapse isn't just about those sequence of events. There's actually a whole bunch of behavioral stuff in here, which I'm very excited to dig into, because this explains a lot. Do you want to go to the
flow chart?
yes, the behavioral flow of money.
Ah.
So, and this is super interesting because by the way, I hope you guys are all sticking in here, because this is all designed to layer up to give you an understanding of where you are today. This isn't just some academic history lesson. This is going to point to, by the end of this, you're going to see exactly where you are right now. And it's going to, I'm sure, open your eyes. So stick with me here as I explain all this, because all of this has a purpose. So there's effectively 4 behavioral dynamics that play out in sequence during these kind of like the monetary life cycle. So in the first instance, you have what's called Gresham's law. And Gresham's law is the bad money drives out good. So what that means is that in a situation where you've got 2 things that you could consider money. So let's say you've got one that's gold. You've got a gold coin, and then you've got a copper coin, right? You're more likely to want to keep the gold coin and spend the copper coin. Yep. And so in that instance, what you actually have is that the good money, the things that have value, people stockpile them, and the bad money actually proliferates into circulation. So you have this situation where the bad money actually thrives in the marketplace because everyone's like, I'm just going to spend that because that's the crap I don't want to hang on to. And the good money, they actually preserve. So in 16th century England, this happened as well. So the coins were clipped and debased. Pure silver vanished from circulation because everyone kept the silver because they knew that was worth something. And then the copper coins were the ones that then got traded and used in the marketplace. In Rome, when the denarius, the silver content of the denarius fell, citizens were hoarding gold, and then they would trade in the denarius, but they'd keep gold in their homes. And people do the same thing. So in Argentina, shopkeepers will keep dollars and spend pesos and doing all of that kind of stuff. So Gresham's law is that bad money drives out good in the marketplace. Okay. And the same thing is happening right now. So people are spending fiat currencies and they're storing things that store value. So whether it be gold, real estate, Bitcoin, these are all like, and I say real estate because real estate is like, well, that's not money. It has been monetized, right? So it has become a form of money in some sense. So Gresham's law, one sec, pardon me. So Gresham's law is that good money, bad money drives out good money. So that's the first step. Then what happens? Gabby, do you want to just check your mic settings? Because I'm getting a bit of echo. And it might be
Sure.
there's that reduce mic background noise or something like that. I think I'm getting a bit of echo coming back. So Gresham's law is that bad money drives out good money. So that happens for a while until trust begins to erode. Once people start to realize that, people's behavior starts to change. So, by the way, inflation doesn't need to be hyperinflation for it to break trust. It can be 10% a year or 20% a year for people to go, well, hang on a second, this ain't right. Something's wrong here. And we've sort of seen that recently. We've seen that recently in the last few years in Australia and the US. Official inflation rates got to whatever, 7-9%, stuff like that. And people were going, whoa, 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 whoa. We ain't signed up for this. Why is milk so expensive? That doesn't make sense. So you don't need hyperinflation for trust to start to break. And it's interesting because I think we're sort of here. Because right now you have a situation, and we'll talk about velocity of money a little bit later as well. So at this point, people start saying, okay, I don't really want, like, I intrinsically know that my currency is not worth it. It's not going to save money. It's losing value. So now what I need to do is I need to move that into something better. So in Turkey, for years, the inflation rate was about 20% a year. And that moved. So people would earn Turkish lira, and then they'd move as quickly as they could. They'd move that into US dollars or euros. So they'd earn the lira and then flip that into US dollars. Argentina, they do the same thing, or they'd move into gold or anything like that. And so this is the kind of situation we're in at the moment, where trust begins to erode, where people start to go, something doesn't feel right, right? And so this is where the breakdown. So Gresham's law. Okay, I've got shit money. I'm going to spend all the shit money. It's all good. And then I'll kind of keep some stuff in the background. Then inflation starts to kick in. And it's like, oh, hang on a second. I'm not even sure if I want this shit money anymore. And I'm not sure if I want that. Then you move to hyperinflation, because that actually starts to be called that the hot potato effect, where it's like, how quickly can I get rid of this? You're giving me something which I think is absolute trash. How quickly can I get rid of it? Now, this is where it gets really, really, really interesting. Right now, and this is an arc, by the way. This is an arc, and again, there's been examples of it happening very, very quickly, and there's examples of it happening very, very slowly. And so, what I don't want you to think that what I'm saying is, oh, everyone run for the hills. We're about to experience hyperinflation. What I am saying is we are on the arc, right? The process is happening, and we're going to keep unpacking this. The next stage after inflation, where people either start to try and take their money out of the system, they stop saving money altogether. They turn to real estate, gold, all of that kind of stuff. They start taking their money out of the system, which is where I believe we are right now. Then the next step is the hot potato effect, where it's like, how quickly can I get rid of the money? Now, this hyperinflation is technically when inflation passes into the realm of 50% per month or more. You just get your head around that for a second. 50% a month. We had like 10% consumer price inflation a couple of years ago, or maybe a little less than. That was insane. People are like, holy crap. Imagine if it was 50% a month. Imagine if it was 50% a month. Now, as I mentioned a second ago, 10% to 20% a year is enough for people to lose faith in a currency.
Yep.
And I will remind everyone listening to this that you don't actually need to get like it as soon as people start to lose faith in a currency, that is when the currency starts to fail. Because if a currency only exists on the basis of trust and faith and mimetic value, and you start to lose that trust and faith, that is when the currency starts to fail.
Yeah.
Right? So this is a very interesting thing to make sure we understand. It doesn't need to get to 50% a month for people to go, something's wrong. It could be 10% a year. And people start to go, something ain't right. But then as people start to lose confidence, people start to say, I don't want this anymore. You move to the hot potato effect. So this is where money's definitely go on. Yep.
Just quickly on the hyperinflation, because I think people in Australia particularly, it's like we're kind of feeling this, like the effects of inflation, and people well, say inflation's crazy, and this is why the Mises quote that we started with, when you read that to me the other week, that was
Mm.
so profound, because it was like anchoring in, like, no, we can get to a point where it just becomes monopoly money. It just
Yeah.
becomes something we don't want. It's that hot potato. We just want to get rid of it. And people don't realize that that is the arc, as you're saying, the pattern that we are following. Like, that's where inflation is pointing towards, not the smaller amount that we have experienced in the last 5-10 years.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bingo. And so when you get to the hot potato effect, so I'll give you a couple of examples. So in Weimar, Germany, which we're going to show some charts on that in a moment, so stick around. Workers were paid twice a day. Wives waited outside factories to rush their wages straight to the baker before prices doubled. Coal became a unit of account. Bread became a better store of value than paper marks at that point in time. In Zimbabwe, people carried $100 billion Garrett notes with 12 zeros. They couldn't buy a bus ticket. In fact, I think they had $100 trillion notes that couldn't buy a loaf of bread in Zimbabwe. $100 trillion
Wild.
notes that couldn't buy a loaf of bread in
Yeah.
Zimbabwe. In Venezuela, bolivars were spent within hours on anything. And basically, the Venezuelans actually moved to US dollars, pesos, or even Bitcoin because the local fiat currency wouldn't work. So then once you get to this hyperinflation, the hot potato effect, where people are just like, and I remember hearing a story of a woman who grew up in Zimbabwe during the kind of 2008 kind of period of time, and her dad would come home from work with a suitcase full of cash, basically a suitcase full of cash. And the first thing he would do, he'd come home, he'd get the kids, they'd get in the car, and they'd race straight to the supermarket, and they'd try and spend all of the cash as quickly as possible, because everything in the supermarket was going to be more expensive the next day. It's crazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what happens. That's when you get to the hot potato effect. Then you get to the fourth stage in the behavioral flow of money, which is Tier's law, which is that good money drives out bad. So eventually the script flips. So when people don't trust the money at all, the bad money stops circulating. So it kind of like goes into wild, crazy circulation. It blows up and then it just dies. And that's when people refuse it, and there's only good quality money remains. So in Rome, barter and gold replaced the denarius before the solidus came in. In Weimar, Germany, when the paper mark collapsed, the Rentenmark was introduced. In Zimbabwe, the Zim dollar died and people moved to US dollars. In Venezuela, people moved from the bolivar to US dollars, all that kind of stuff. And so Tier's law is the opposite of Gresham's law. So once trust is broken, good money doesn't hide, it takes over, right? It starts to move in a different direction. Make sense?
Yep.
We've got a lot to cover, and I realize we're 58 minutes in. So should we just keep on plowing?
Keep on keeping on, yeah.
Let's keep on keeping on. Okay, so what I want to touch on here, and by the way, we are going to turn this into, I've written a 40-something page report. Gabby's going to make it awesome, because at the moment it's just in a Google Doc. What is the cycle from Tier's to Gresham's law? Gabby, do you want to go back to the two slides to the cycle?
Yeah. Or do you mean timeline? Like,
no, he said, what's the cycle, right? So this is the thing. So new currency is issued, inflation is a policy, public recognition, flight to real asset, money fails, new currency is issued. So a new currency gets issued, and then people then start to use that again, and they keep some of the good value stuff in the background. So it's basically those two things tie together. Now, I want to talk about just quickly some of the top 5 hyperinflations. You want to just go to that? Because I think it's worth taking a look at where this can go. And by the way, as I say, Gabby's going to turn this into an awesome report, because at the moment it's just a bunch of my ramblings on a page. And we're going to share this in the Investor Lab community. So it'll be free in the Investor Lab community. There's a link in the description. You can join the community. It's free. We'll have it in here. It's super. I mean, if you think this is interesting, then you're going to want to get the reports, and it doesn't cost anything. Yeah. There's no opt-ins. There's nothing like that. It's just free information. So these are some of the worst hyperinflations in history, but this gives you a context about how bad things can get when people lose, when trust in the currency dies. This is what can happen. So in Hungary, the monthly inflation rate was 4.19 times 10 to the power of 16.
Cool.
That's 41.9 quadrillion % a month inflation rate. So that's an equivalent of a 207% per day inflation rate, or a 15 prices were doubling every 15 hours. In Zimbabwe, it was 79.6 billion %, which is 7.96 times 10 to the power of 10. Prices were doubling every 24.7 hours. Yugoslavia in 1994. By the way, what's interesting about this is they're also slightly different timelines. Hungary, 1946. Zimbabwe, 2008. Yugoslavia, 1994. Weimar, Germany, 1923. Greece, 1944. There's plenty of other examples too. Argentina, I'll show that on a graph a little bit later. There's tons. There's a whole bunch of them, right? Venezuela, again, we've mentioned as well. Weimar, Germany, which we'll show a chart of shortly, in 1923, reached a monthly inflation rate of 29,500%. Prices were doubling every 3.7 days. And this, by the way, all of this has come from a really amazing study that was conducted by someone with last name Hunke and someone with last name Cruz, and is pulled from the Hunke-Cruz hyperinflation table, which is the gold standard in hyperinflation reporting. And I will actually share the PDF of the Hunke-Cruz hyperinflation table in the community as well for all of you who want to like dig in and see some of the other examples. There's a ton in there, and they are just crazy. Let me know in the chat if this is kind of mind blowing to you, that the prices could double in 15 hours, 1.4 days, 4.3 days. Because once that happens, the velocity of money increases. The velocity of money, like, because people are just trying to spend it as quickly as possible until the velocity of money dies. So, and we'll talk about velocity of money a little bit later, but basically it goes through two arcs. And in the first instance, the velocity of money slows down because people are taking their money out and they're saying, I don't want to spend it. I want to invest it. I want to monetize other assets. Then the velocity of money increases where they're just, actually, I'm just going to get this shit out of here as quickly as possible. I need to buy consumables. And then the velocity of money collapses again. So it goes in a wave. So, yeah. So, should we just jump to, let's jump to gold, because there's a whole bunch more in here in the report that I put together, but I'm not going to try and go through everything because there's just too much stuff in here. Let's actually move to gold. Now, why gold? Gold is super interesting because gold has broadly kept its purchasing power the same for thousands of years. Now, I'm not a gold bug, but gold as a store of value is pretty good. So in 1000 AD, an ounce of gold could buy you a full set of quality clothing. So the medieval equivalent of a tailored suit, or cover several months of living expenses for a family. In 1500 AD, it could still buy very similar, buy fine clothing, several livestock, or rent and taxes for an extended period. In 2025, 1 ounce of gold, now priced over $3,400 an ounce, can still buy a tailored suit, cover a month's rent in many cities, and provide a modest month's living for one, right? So gold is a good yardstick for measuring currencies against over time, because it's been so relatively stable. It's super interesting because the first time I heard about this, you can buy, I don't know how much gold is required, but to buy one, you can buy the equivalent amount of wheat today. Use the same amount of gold that you would spend on that same amount of wheat in Roman times is the same amount of wheat you would get for the same amount of gold today. It's kept its purchasing power over several thousand years. Yeah, it's super interesting, right? So the details of what it will buy might change, but the value is the same. So do you want to bring up the chart of US gold in US dollars since 1923? Because this is going to start to articulate where we're at right now. So this chart here shows us the price of gold in US dollars since 1923. Now, the reason this chart is interesting is because I want you to look at the dates at the bottom. Before 1971, we can see 1972 on the chart there. Before 1971, the amount of gold that you would buy per US dollar was basically flat. It was a flat line. It was a flat line all the way back because the US dollar was pegged to gold. Then in August 1971, they removed that peg, and you can see that moment. You can see the flat line of when it was pegged, and then you can see the, in inverted commas, price of gold, not the value of gold. The price of gold in US dollars absolutely has exploded since 1971. So if we keep going to have a look at the US money supply, because this kind of tells a bit of the story as well. So if you have a look at that's how many US dollars it takes to buy gold. And then if we go to the US M2 chart, so this is the increase in money supply, M2 money supply. So those familiar with the show will know that there's different measures of money: M0, M1, M2, M3. Australia uses M3. It's a broader measurement of money than M2. Most of the world uses M2. So in the US, the M2 money supply, so the amount of dollars they've printed, has been growing exponentially since 1971 particularly, but certainly even before that, right? So they started to print. So in fact, you can see on this chart, it's actually been increasing since 1959. And this kind of points to what I was saying earlier, that they didn't start printing more money after they broke the gold standard in 1971. They started printing money before that. And that's actually why, like in 1969, you can still, if you look at this chart, you'll be like, why is the money gone up? It's because they were printing more money. They're printing more and more money because they had to fund the Vietnam War. It was only in 1971 that it broke the relationship. Now, if we keep going down to the next chart, what we'll see here is that this is the price of gold in US dollars since 1971. So yeah, it's a bit of a zoomed in version of that one we were just looking at in 1923. But I want you to pay attention to this, because this shows that the price of gold, or the amount of dollars required to buy an ounce of gold, has increased by about 8,800% between the 2nd of August 1971 and the 2nd of September 2025. Okay, so it's increased by about 8,817%. That is the amount of dollars required to buy an ounce of gold. Now, if we go to the next chart. Now, this is interesting, because if you take the gold, the price of gold, and divide it by the money supply, what you'll actually see is that the price of gold actually hasn't gone up that much at all. Now, what you can see here is there was a spike in the amount of in the value of gold versus US dollars in 1980s, but broadly what you see is a channel between 1971 and 2025. You see that it has been broadly flat. Now, in nominal terms, or in observational terms, it says that it's up 174%. That's vastly different from the 8,800% that it is up in nominal terms. So it looks like, in nominal terms, in US dollar terms, it looks like it's a rocket ship. But if you actually divide the amount of currency that's been created in the US down, you actually get to this kind of a much more representative price of gold. And what I would say by looking at that chart is that is a fairly flat chart with a few standard deviations based on supply and demand. Is that making sense, Gabby? Is the way I'm explaining this making sense?
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
Okay, let me know in the chat if this is making sense to you guys as well. Because what this is actually showing is the gold has broadly stayed flat, you know, with some oscillation, you know, with some standard deviations based on different geopolitical events which have increased the demand or the lack of demand thereof for gold over time. But it certainly hasn't gone up in nominal terms at the rate that it appears to have gone up in US dollars. So that tells us that what we've got massive money printing, because the value of gold, the purchasing power of gold, has stayed basically the same for millennia, right? And then the amount of US dollars it costs to buy an ounce of gold has gone through the roof. But in fact, if you then divide that by the money supply, you can actually see that it's basically flat. It hasn't really changed much at all, which tells us we are witnessing the collapse of a currency, albeit over a period of 50 years. In fact, you want to go to the next chart here, because I think this is one of the most interesting. So Weimar Germany, which is one of the most famous cases of hyperinflation and currency collapse. The chart on the left is the value of one gold mark in paper marks. And you can see that between 1918 and 1923, so roughly a 5-year period, that absolutely blew through the roof. And that was the collapse of the paper mark, the German paper mark in Weimar, Germany. Now, the chart on the right is the value of 1 ounce of gold in US dollars. Now, that is from 1970 or 1971 through to 2025. So let's call that 50 years for simplicity's sake. But you can't look at those two charts and not tell me that there's similarities there, right? What do you think?
They're at least cousins.
Yeah. So in the Weimar Germany example, the collapse was very sudden. Over the course of 5 years, the entire currency collapsed. And so we hear about these hyperinflation scenarios, and we go, oh my God, these things, they blow up really, really quickly. But then if you think back to what we were talking about earlier about the Roman, the denarius, that was a 300-year currency collapse. And so what we can see here in the US dollar is it's a 50-year currency collapse so far. Now, granted, the percentages aren't quite as high as the German mark example either, but hey, we're still early. Now, so these things can happen over different timescales, but the direction is pretty much the same. And by the way, if you just want to go to the next chart as well, just in case you are wondering, how does the Australian dollar stack up? Well, if you can imagine what the US dollar is doing versus gold, the orange line on this chart is gold in Australian dollar prices. So, Blake, you asked in the chat, how much you bought an ounce of gold for 1,700 AUD. I don't know how much it is today, but I think it's over $5,000 AUD for an ounce of gold. So what's actually happening in Australian dollars is it's actually worse because the Australian dollar is devaluing faster than the US dollar. So we can see that this is happening again to the Australian dollar, and it's happening in real time. Is this making sense? Because this brings everything in. This should be bringing everything into focus. This is my hope. This is my objective, right? With this, is that if we can see how these things play out, we can understand the pattern, and then we can have the perspective to see where we're at in real time. Are we on track, Gabby, or am I just waffling?
No, I think what I find interesting is in the report you've labeled it the Weimar Rhine, because I think it is that seeing the pattern again as we said at the start of the episode. It's like you can see, even if the timescale may be different, but you can see that shape is similar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so again, I'm not sitting here and saying, oh, we're experiencing hyperinflation. What I am saying is that all fiat currencies die. No currency has ever died from deflation. They've all died from inflation, monetary inflation. And they happen over different timescales, different speeds, different severities, all that kind of stuff, but they all go in the same direction. They all follow the same pattern. Mm-hmm. And all fiat prints itself into oblivion over time. And particularly in the last century, because of the Bretton Woods system, and everyone picked the US dollar, then every currency became a fiat float. Currencies are collapsing all around us. And this is explaining why asset prices are going up. This explains why stock market's gone up so much. This explains why house prices go up so much. This explains why Bitcoin goes up so much. Now, Bitcoin also has other things that are making it go up faster than the rate of monetary debasement, but that's another point. Same with technology. But broadly, these things are going in that direction because they're all following the same pattern. In fact, let's crack on and let's finish a couple of things, and then we can kind of like recap on some of this stuff, because I want to show you guys what is happening in terms of money printing, because this isn't just a US problem. Because everyone talks about the US, they're like, oh, US debt problem, US is printing heaps of money, but actually there's more to it than that. So we've already seen that the value of gold didn't really move. The amount of dollars it requires to buy gold has moved. Gabby, do you want to bring up the chart that shows the flip forward a couple? Yeah, the multi-country M2 money supply comparison. So it's easy to think that this is a US problem, and it's easy to think, oh, okay, so the US is printing all this money. That sucks. But if you have a look at this chart is from 1995. You can see that China's M2 has increased by M2, again being a measure of money supply or money circulating in the economy, has increased by 5,500%. India's M2 has increased by 3,900%. Australia's M3, which is a broader measurement of money, has increased by 1,063%. United States M2 has increased by 530%, and the Eurozone has increased by 400% since. That's only been around since Euro has only been around since 1999, the Euro currency. Now, what is interesting, and this is kind of what I was pointing to earlier, is that China has had a deliberate policy of monetary debasement, so that it can stay cost competitive to the rest of the world, so that it can become, so that it becomes so permeated through every part of the global economic system, through supply chains and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. Blake, I could get Canadian dollars or any other dollars and I can put them all up on a chart, but this is just to give us a spread. They're all going in the same direction, right? They're all going in the same direction. it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter which one you look at. They're all going in the wrong direction. They're all going up and to the right. And in fact, if you just quickly go to the next chart, Gabby, I had to put this on a separate chart, but this shows you. This still has, by the way, China, India, Australia, US, and the euro on there, but they now look like flat lines compared to Argentina, which has increased by 363,393% over the same period, and it's basically a vertical line. So that's a very clear example of how bad these things can get when they're left unchecked. Now, some currencies are better than others, right? Which is why if you're in Turkey, you might want to swap your lira for US dollars. If you're in Egypt, you might want to swap your Egyptian dollar for US dollars, because some currencies are better than other currencies, but they're all bad, right? They're all moving in the wrong direction. They're all collapsing, just at different speeds. All fiat currencies die, right? And that is what we are seeing playing out here. Now, that is all, and again, I'll say it again, that is why asset prices are going up. That is why you can't save that's why you can't save money in dollars. That's why it explains so much. It's why healthcare and education systems are the way they are. It explains why consumerism is the way that it is. It explains so much. And so there is no like better solution here, right? Other than to move your money out of fiat. Now, one of the things I want to talk about next is what happens to debt when currencies collapse. You want to just stop sharing, because this is super interesting. Because what happens to debt when currencies collapse, I think, is one of the most interesting things to think about.
Yeah.
Because people think about prices going up and all of that kind of stuff, but the value of debt goes down as well. So inflation melts debt. So if you know how to play the game here, so just imagine this. So let's say you borrow $300,000 to buy a house, but then inflation wipes out 90% of the value of a currency's purchasing power. That means you still owe $300,000 on paper, but in real terms, the debt has the purchasing power weight of $30,000 in the current money. Now, this actually happened in Germany, by the way. So this actually was one of the big things that happened in Germany, where owners had asset prices inflate, and they were paid rent and stuff in nominal terms. So let's say you owned a house, and let's say you had $300,000 mortgage on it, and let's say you were collecting $300 a week in rent. But then the currency started to collapse and everything like that, and then the rent, you increase the rent. But putting aside the fact you probably couldn't increase rent straight away, but let's say you could increase rent to, $30,000 a week because the currency's collapsed. Then all of a sudden you could pay off your entire mortgage with 10 weeks worth of the rent, because the mortgage has stayed at $300,000, but the rent's gone up. And this is what happened. This is what happened in Germany. So in Germany it was crazy. They were actually burning bricks of money, because it was cheaper to burn money than it was to pay for firewood, which is crazy, right? So they were burning money to stay warm because it was cheaper. It was cheaper to burn money than it was to buy firewood. People would take their salaries home in wheelbarrows, and nobody was worried about anyone stealing any money out of the wheelbarrows, because it was worth shit anyway. Nobody cared. So what can happen in these inflationary environments? And by the way, let me restate, this is already happening today. Now, we're not talking about Weimar Germany hyperinflation, but we have monetary inflation. Monetary inflation is eating away at your debt by about 10% a year ish, give or take, right, on average. So that means that you're wiping out your debt over time anyway. And this is exactly how people can get ahead in an inflationary environment. Now, I'm not advocating go and get credit cards and go do reckless, stupid, dumb, get heaps of debt. But if you can use debt effectively to buy productive assets, then the debt stays the same in kind of like fixed nominal terms, but then everything else can change around it, and it devalues the debt into the future. One of the best examples of this was Hugo Stinnes. I'm going to try and speak a bit of German. He was known as der Inflationskönig. Sorry to any of the Germans out there. Der Inflationskönig, the inflation king. So in Weimar, Germany, Hugo Stinnes is a great example. So in Weimar, Germany, he saw the money printing happening, and he did the maths, and he did it before everybody else. Yeah.
No, I was like, surely it's Hugo Steins, but we don't know. It's like Stein.
Maybe
Maybe.
STINNES. Maybe. I don't know. I clearly can't pronounce German stuff very well, so
We
maybe you're
don't know.
right. We don't know. Anyway, but the inflation king, right? So he could see
Yeah.
he could see that that after World War One, the Germans, the printing press was on, and he could see what was happening. So what he did is he went and got as much debt as he could. He borrowed massively, aggressively, and he bought productive hard assets. So he bought coal mines, steel mills, factories, shipping lines. He just bought all these massive, big infrastructure companies that had hard assets. That was one of the things. They actually had to have like hard assets, like a coal mine had coal in the ground plus machinery, shipping, like train lines had the trains and the train lines and the actual rail lines and all that kind of stuff. So he bought all these hard assets. What happened is the value of his assets, because the value of the currency crashed, in nominal terms, the value of his assets went through the roof. The prices that he was charging went up with inflation. So, for example, if you're selling coal, the price of coal goes up with inflation, but the debts he used to pay for those assets stayed the same. So he paid off the debts in no time because everything went through the roof, and ended up being one of the richest men in all of Europe. He's often referred to as the richest man in Germany. If you want to look up his, that's kind of like one of his monikers as well. So, and that principle still exists today, and that's exactly how real estate investors are getting so far ahead so quickly, because they're buying real assets. So, by the way, let's just take a little step back here and kind of like sideline a little bit. What happened in Weimar, Germany is a really, really, really great case study. Again, it happened over the course of 5 years. So just extend the timeline and you kind of understand where we're at. So what happened is, because the money printing increased, so asset prices increased, which meant that everyday people couldn't afford to buy houses because houses became too expensive. So then more and more people were forced to rent. Now, the people who already owned houses, they became wealthy and they were able to buy more houses. They were able to take out debt, which the debt lost value in real terms versus the money which is being printed. So they were able to buy more houses, and more people got priced out of buying houses because of inflation, monetary inflation driving the prices of houses up. So more people became renters, and the rent went up with inflation as well. So then the asset owners were getting paid more and more in rent, but the people who didn't own anything, they basically were devastated. They basically lost everything, right? They were burning money just to stay warm, and they could barely afford food because everything blew out. The same thing is effectively happening in Australia. So what created was a massive divide between the asset owners and the consumers, and that's sort of that whole kind of bifurcation in the social structure happened there and then as well, which is crazy. And that's, again, so just take the understanding, stretch the timeline, then think about where we are today, and then you can start to see that it is happening now, just more slowly, which is awesome because it's happening slowly, so you can take advantage of it and not just be a victim of it, right? So, but if you can understand this, it's such a huge opportunity. So you can effectively still, you can still do the Hugo Stinnes playbook today, as long as you're careful. And I'm not willy nilly advocating everyone to just go and get up to the eyeballs in debt. I'm not, be sensible.
Yep.
Don't not financial advice or whatever. But the principle is the same. If you buy hard, productive assets, even if you buy businesses that provide essential services or goods, not services, but essential goods that people are still going to want to buy. Like if you bought a bakery, let's just say you bought a bakery in Weimar, Germany, and you bought it using debt. Well, the bakery is still going to sell bread. The price of bread is going to go through the roof, right? And then so you can take 10% of every loaf of bread, and you're going to be able to pay down the debt pretty quickly. And so if you've got productive assets, they survive well, which is also why, by the way, when I think we're going to talk about asset selection and all of that kind of stuff in another episode, but this is also why I think I'm so bullish on real estate. So real estate holds its value. Its value gets inflated by monetary inflation, but also holds its value because of utility. Bitcoin is different because you have a non-inflationary asset, so it stays still when inflation moves around it, right? But then also, if you look at technology equities, one of the ways to think about that is the companies that can provide the most amount of deflation capture most of the market share, because it's the inverse force to inflation. So real estate is such a tremendously valuable thing to be able to own in an inflationary environment. And if we're watching our currency, the Australian dollar, the US dollar, Canadian dollar, Chinese yuan, Japanese yen, euro, British pound, you name it, they're all doing the same thing. They're all doing the same thing. So when I say our currencies, we're watching the global fiat system melt down. Now, it might take several more years. I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm not here to prognosticate on that specifically, but more to highlight where you are and what you can do about it. So I feel like I'm waffling a little bit here, Gabby, but are we on track?
We're on track. I think what, I always like to come back to practicality. It's like, what can people do? What can people do with this information?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So the first thing I would say, and we haven't covered the velocity of money, but maybe we can skip that anyway. That can just be feed for those who want to read the report. What can you do about it? I think it's really, really, really interesting, right? But the first thing to understand is that fiat is for spending. Fiat currency is for spending. It's not a store of value. So you can't save.
Yeah.
So fiat is for spending. Assets are for saving. Right. That's the easiest way to think about it. Fiat is for spending and assets are for saving. Now, what types of assets matter the most? Well, you want assets that can't be easily printed into existence. Okay. So when you think about assets, you want hard assets with a fixed supply, or assets which are going to benefit from monetary inflation, or assets which are the inverse force. And so real estate, phenomenally good asset to own, because you own a physical, tangible asset that exists in the real world, which is productive, which has a utility value, and is scarce. And as we've covered in previous episodes, the stock to flow ratio of real estate is actually higher than gold. So it's scarcer than gold in Australia. Like it's a better asset than gold in Australia. So real estate's awesome because it's productive. People always need a roof over their head, so they need shelter. So it is income producing, rent producing. It is it benefits from the forces of monetary inflation, and even if and when there's a complete currency changeover, when trust in currency, when the currency collapses at some point in the future, which it almost certainly will. And look, in the future could be 10 years, 20. I don't know. So I'm not here to kind of fearmonger. That's not what I'm not trying to do. But if we just kind of follow the pattern, it will collapse at some point. All fiat currencies die at some point. Yeah. But even at that point, you will still have the land, the house, a productive asset. Like real estate's freaking awesome. And it's proven to be one of the best assets to be able to hold through these kind of things. If you were to think about, so the way that I think about all of this, my broad macro investing thesis is there's three pillars. Real estate, because to the degree that money printing is going to continue to exist, that's going to drive housing prices through the roof. It'll also drive rents up as well, right? So that is placing a bet that monetary inflation is going to continue, which it will. Bitcoin is a fixed cap commodity, which it has an inflation rate, but only up to the degree that all 21 million are mined, and it's basically crazy high stock to flow ratio. So it's not people call it a deflationary asset. It's not deflationary. It's non-inflationary, right? There's an inflation of supply, but it's a capped supply. It's a fixed supply commodity. So that is basically a way of taking your capital out of an inflating system. So real estate is a bet with an inflating system. Okay, money printing is going to continue to happen. My house prices are going to continue to go up. Good. Bitcoin is a way of taking your capital out of an inflating system. Okay, so I'm going to take a portion of my capital and I'm going to put it in something that isn't going to be printed. Can't be printed. They're not going to print more of it, right? So that's fine. Then you've got technology equities. And that is the countervailing force. That is a bet on deflation. And so the companies that are going to capture the most amount of value over the next 5 and 10 years are the companies that can deflate the most. If you think about this, and we'll talk about this more in another episode, Amazon, Uber, Apple, Netflix, Tesla, these are all companies that have driven massive levels of deflation. And the value of their company has increased directly, linearly, or directly in relationship to the amount of deflation they've been able to drive into the marketplace. Now, you might say, oh, but iPhones are expensive and they've always been expensive. Yes, but an iPhone combines a phone, a camera, a calculator, a computer, all of this kind of stuff. And so on the macro, it's created a lot of deflation because you used to have, I remember I used to carry around a digital camera and all of these different things. Now that's all collapsed into one. That's deflationary by nature. Plus, then you've got the app store. So then you've got all the apps on your phone. Now that software eats the world. So software is massively deflationary. So it's enabled, the app store has enabled so much deflation. So Apple's a funny one because it's a premium product price, so they've got pricing power, which is one of the key things you want to look for, but they're also deflationary at the same time. That's why they've become one of the most valuable companies in the world, if not the current most valuable company in the world. Anyway, but if you look into the future and you look at things like, Tesla, for example. So if they pull off the Optimus robot type thing, that's going to deflate the value of labor around the entire world, right? And so they're going to capture the effective economic value of labor around the world, which is a $60 trillion market. Not necessarily that there was only, not necessarily saying that they're going to capture the entire labor market, but you get the idea. The deflationary force is going to be directly related to the value capture. And so if you can recognize that you are in a slow grinding collapse of the currency, you have the time and the optics to be able to go, okay, cool. How am I going to deploy my capital? Fiat is for spending, assets are for saving. And you've got, in my opinion, 3 smart ways to save. Now, you may want to save some in gold as well, and that's your prerogative. And I'm not going to tell you to not do that. I'm not anti-gold. I'm just not pro-gold because I think there's better options. So if you want to buy gold, go buy gold. You want to buy silver, go buy silver. And maybe, by the way, maybe it makes sense. Maybe it makes sense to have some gold and silver coins so that if you need to move country for some reason, you have some way to use it as a physical currency. If you need to, the way that I've heard it described is if you need to flee the country, you need something to bribe the border guards, and maybe gold coins are good for that. Now, you may think that all this sounds like pretty extreme and everything like that, but this is what is happening in the world if you open your eyes. There's a great, I say it's great. I'm 3/4 of the way through it, but there's a podcast that just released with Ray Dalio on Diary of a CEO. Now, I don't watch Diary of a CEO all that much, but I do like Ray Dalio. And he talks about, the changing world order, and he talks about the 5 forces and all of this kind of stuff. He's pointing to the same thing. He's saying there's different drivers and stuff, but it's the same kettle of fish. The currencies are collapsing, and there is going to be a changing world order, and you need to prepare for that. And you need to buy the right kind of assets that are going to help you through that. One of the interesting things as well, and I was mentioning this to you this morning, Gabby, was he was telling a story on that podcast about how he was a clerk on the stock exchange floor in August of 1971 when the US broke the gold standard. And he thought, oh my God, this is going to be crazy and everything's going to crash. But in fact, the opposite happened. Everything went through the roof. And that was his first experience of living through a devaluation. Now, there'd also been a temporary devaluation in 1933 when I think it was Roosevelt temporarily suspended the gold standard and prices went through the roof, again, because of inflation. But he lived through that moment of actually one day it was tied to the gold standard, the next day it wasn't, and he saw prices shoot through the roof because that was him living through a devaluation. So he has that perspective of like a before and after moment where he was like, could see the two sides of that. We collectively have all been born into this environment of inflating currency. So we don't have that perspective. Yeah. But if we can get that perspective and you can go, oh, wait, okay, hang on a second. 90% of everything that I understand and believe is driven by the fact that they're inflating currencies around the world, right? Then you can start to think about how to play the game in a way that's going to set you up for success and longevity. Buying things that are going to survive and thrive in a high inflationary environment, like real estate, top of the list, Bitcoin, it's an way out of the game. And then technology equities, higher risk for sure, technology equities. And that's why you need to be careful with those too. So does that help?
Yes.
Good. So there's a lot more in this, guys. And if you found this interesting, we don't have enough time. We'd probably need about another 45 minutes to fully unpack stuff. One thing that I just want to talk about, actually, let's quickly, you know what? I'm not done yet, actually. Can you quickly share the velocity of money chart?
Sure.
So, because one of the things that is typically a signal to look out for in to know, like, hey, are we entering into a hyperinflation, is the velocity of money. Now, this is the velocity of money, just US money supply. What you'll notice is that since 1999-ish, the velocity of money has been going down. Now, typically, what you would expect to see if a currency was collapsing is you would expect to see the velocity of money go up, because people are like, they're just like trying to spend it as quickly as possible. But
Yeah.
here's the problem. This velocity of money, or any velocity of money metric, only measures the velocity of money spent on consumer goods. So it's so if everyone was racing around buying bread and stockpiling cans of beans and stuff like that, yes, that would show up in the velocity of money calculation. But what has been happening, and this goes back to sort of where we're at in this cycle, because we're at the inflation and not the hot potato stage of the cycle, people are monetizing assets. And so what's happening is they're taking so Gresham's law is that is good, bad money drives out good, right? So what people are doing is they're taking the bad money and then they're monetizing assets. So they're monetizing real estate, Bitcoin, stocks, all of this kind of stuff. So they're taking their capital out of the market. So optically, it looks like the velocity is going down, and it's like, oh, okay, this is all good. This isn't inflationary. But actually what's happening is the money's exiting the market and not going back into it. And the way to kind of litmus test this in your mind is that over this period of time, from 1999 through to 2025, the US government has printed more money over that period of time than they did in their entire history before that. So the amount of money produced has gone over that period of time has gone through the roof. Trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars have been printed by the US. But at the same time, the velocity of money has gone down. And so, those two things seem like they're in opposing forces. But actually what's happening is people are taking that money and they're trying to buy better things with it. And they're monetizing assets. They're monetizing, as I say, real estate, equities, Bitcoin, because they're like, this fiat is not good. I need to go buy other things. And this is before we get to the hot potato money scenario where people are just trying to spend it on consumer goods as fast as possible. So
yeah,
I thought that was a useful contribution.
Yeah, and again, bringing it back to people having trust in the currency, right? It's like we're at that tipping point of, and I'm sure everyone can feel it. We're particularly watching what's happening in the US at the moment, which bleeds to the rest of the world. But it is that sense of going back to the quote at the start. It's like the masses waking up, not just go too woke, but we're feeling that sense of like the trust is corroding before it flips over to the next phase, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. So I'm just going to read that von Mises quote again, because I think now that we've covered so much ground, let me go back to it because I think it might hit a little bit differently for those of you who are still here. So the quote from von Mises is, "But then finally the masses wake up. They become suddenly aware of the fact that inflation is a deliberate policy and will go on endlessly. A breakdown occurs. The crack up boom appears. Everybody is anxious to swap his money against real goods, no matter whether he needs them or not, no matter how much he has to pay for them. Within a very short time, within a few weeks or even days, the things that were used as money are no longer used as a medium of exchange. They become scrap paper. Nobody wants to give away anything against them. It was this that happened with the continental currency in America in 1781, with the French mandats territoriaux in 1796, and with the German mark in 1923. It will happen again whenever the same conditions appear. If a thing has to be used as a medium of exchange, public opinion must not believe that the quantity of this thing will increase beyond all bounds. Inflation is a policy that cannot last." And hopefully, now that we've gone through all of this stuff, you can see that and hopefully this is the wake up moment for you when you get to actually wake up and go, oh, hang on a second. This isn't just life getting a little bit harder. There is deliberate policy in place. And again, I'm not suggesting it's it's because it's so slow and it happens over so many different, political epochs and stuff like that. It's just kind of like the way it's done. But nonetheless, policy decisions are shaping a perpetual money printing environment, which is shaping our current world. And if you can wake up to that, then you will start to realize that the fiat currency that you have got is not worth the paper it's printed on. And your incentive is to then go buy better assets that are productive, assets that will store your value, assets that are going to protect you and your family's wealth. And we will go through those in a future episode as well. I think we've covered enough for today on this topic. And again, we will turn this into a report and we'll put it into the community. Two things I want to cover off before we go. I I want to cover off something that we talked about in last week's episode. If you can, Gabby, if you can just go into the slide 32, house prices adjusted for M3 money supply growth.
Sure.
So last week, where we talked about the illusion of prosperity, where we talked about which, I'm not going to cover over all of that. One of the charts that I shared was this: house prices adjusted for M3 money supply growth, and it caused a little bit of contention because people were like, "Oh shit, I thought real estate tracked monetary inflation, or shit, does this mean that real estate's going down in value?" Or had somebody say, "But this doesn't capture population growth and real estate supply growth." And so I just wanted to talk about a couple of things with this, because if you are a believer in real estate, you can look at this and go, "Oh shit, am I investing in the wrong thing?" Which you're not. Let me just by the way, hopefully you can tell enough by now that if we thought it was the wrong thing, we'd just be telling you it's the wrong thing. But there's a couple of parts in this. So number one, this is house prices adjusted for M3 money supply growth. So the house prices captures both the increase in property supply and also the increase in demand through population. So it by proxy absorbs those two variants, which is the increase in population, because that increases the demand side of the equation, and increases and the supply side, which is property supply increase. So by proxy, the price is an outcome of the supply and demand equation, which accounts for the population and the change in population and also the change in property supply. So that is captured in that as well. So that's an important distinction. Now, the other thing here is this is the average. Now, I don't have what this is in average in percentage terms, but on average over the last 40 years, property price growth has been about 8.2%. And monetary inflation, M3 inflation, has been about 10%, right? So there's a difference between those two. Now, this assumes that you're buying the average property. Now, if you're buying the average property, then yes, in aggregate, the average property price is losing value versus M3 money supply growth. But that is not the right way to think about it. Now, as we showed in the last episode as well, once you add leverage, you massively outperform debasement, even if you just buy an average property with 80% LVR. The point here is, and maybe you can stop sharing that now. The point here is that we're not trying to buy average assets. So that is when you look at the average. You don't want to buy an average asset. No one wants to buy an average asset. What you want to buy is you want to buy an above average asset. And so the lens that we particularly look at real estate through is we look at it through the lens of Dashdot. And if I look at real estate through the lens of Dashdot, one of the things that I know to be true after buying how many properties we bought now? Over 2,300 properties.
Yep.
Just over, actually, 2,322 by the looks of it. The average growth that our clients have achieved in the first year is 22%. Not 8.25%, 22%. Over a 3-year period, the compound annual growth rate for our clients on average over 2,300 properties is about 16.5%, which is double the average growth rate of 8.25%. And so whilst you can look at that chart, you can go, "Oh my God, it goes down a bit." It's like, yeah, if you're maybe in aggregate, if you're buying the average, but you're not buying the average if you're working with Dashdot. And I just wanted to temper that out a little bit, because, part of the goal is for us to be able to identify how to find the right places, the right properties in the right place at the right time, where the demand factor is there, where the conditions are right, so that you can get outsized returns, so you can beat the debasement rate, which you're going to be doing anyway when you add leverage to it anyway. But I just wanted to highlight that, because I thought it was just a little kind of missed piece of detail from the last episode.
Yeah, so cool. Great.
Final thing is, we're not doing a podcast next Friday. We're doing it on Wednesday. So Gabby and I are traveling a bit over the next couple of weeks, and we're traveling at different times in different places. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be doing these lives on Wednesdays. So we will update you in the community when those are happening. We are also going to take a break in this little series. So remember, we started a little series about why it's getting harder to get ahead and what to do about it. Last week we started with the illusion of prosperity. Today we covered the great melt up when trust and money dies. And the next part of this series is actually going to be talking more about what to do about it. Okay, like the types of assets. We're going to talk about the inflation, productivity delta, all that kind of stuff. But I'm not going to have time to prepare for that by Wednesday. So
Mhm.
we are going to take a little break, little pause in the series, and then we're doing a bit of traveling and stuff like that. We're going to see family. So we're going to take a little pause in the series. And for the next 2 Wednesdays, we're going to be doing some different topics. Then we're going to come back and we're going to pick this up and we're going to be talking about the types of assets to help you navigate through this kind of the environment that we're in as well. So that's a little public service announcement too.
Perfect.
Cool.
Great.
Anything else you want to cover off, Gabby?
No, again, this is a huge report that Goose has been working on really hard the last week or so. I'm going to tidy it up and get it in the community as soon as I can. We are in the community, so it's not like we're just going to post it and then leave you on your own. If you have any questions about it, jump in the community, ask us. We're more than happy to jump in and just have a chat about it in there. And the link is
Yes.
in the show notes if you want to join us, if you are not already in there.
Awesome.
That's all.
And shameless plug, if you do want to beat inflation and you do want to build a prolific and profitable property portfolio, then there's a link in the description and the show notes to book in a time to have a chat with Dashdot as well to help you grow your portfolio and to crush the monetary inflation dilemma that you face. Good luck out there. See you in the next episode. Bye for now.